In our last lesson, we created, using Node.js's modules, we created a server. And I want to remind you, before we move on, that you should be getting comfortable with exploring this website, the Nodejs Documentation. If I go to Docs and I look at version 8.9.1, because that's where we are. So this is sort of your manual, your description of all of the modules and things that are available resident within Node.js. For example, if I click on Usage and Example, right off the bat, this should look fairly familiar because we did this in our last lesson. So this is an example of utilizing things like create server, which are specific to Node.js. Node.js is methods and so forth. So this gives us an example of that we've just did of creating a server using Node.js. So I would encourage you to start getting comfortable with using this site to look up. If you maybe you did some research and you found some code and you're wondering, it seems to work, but there's some foreign things in here, we'll certainly come in here and start looking at what these foreign things might mean. For example, bring your attention to some things that we're going to be using in our next example. If I look here under globals, I can see that, and I'm going to be using this dir name, and that's a double underscore. It's hard to see there, but that is a double underscore. And if I click on directory name, so this is something that gives me the ability, it'll return a string, gives me the ability to get the directory name of from whatever the directory that the file I'm requesting is currently sitting in. So that's going to be helpful. We'll see that in a minute. Something else I want to draw your attention to, again, because it's something we're going to be using shortly, is path. So what is path? Well, let's see. Path is a module that is a utility that works with file and directory paths. Oh, that sounds handy. And we're also going to be utilizing path.join. So if I click on path.join, you'll see that it gives us the ability to join different segments, path segments together. Fantastic. So we'll see how that all works. But if you were to see it, if you saw something in Stack Overflow or what have you, I would highly encourage you to come in here and see what exactly is it that is being done in the code. Kind of make it less hieroglyphic, so to speak. All right, so I'm going to come over to npm and I'm going to introduce you to a new package called Express. And Express is the first find. So Express is a framework. It is a module that will give us the ability to work with our server. It's a framework, but it's going to help us create a server. In this case, what we're going to use it for is to create a server just like we did, except much easier. So, if I click on the word Express here, I should do let me do a control click so I have both of those open at the same time. Not quite what I meant to do, not a shift click. There we go. So here's my Express web page, and this gives us some more information about Express. Admittable, flexible Node.js web application framework that provides a robust set of features for web and mobile application. That sounds interesting. All right, so this is what we're going to use today to help us do the same thing we did in our last lesson, except much quicker. So let's dig in and see what the deal is. So here's an example of doing what we did in our last lesson. So here is utilizing Express to not only create a server for us, but then it is getting, and this is the method get, like post or get based on this request. Here's an anonymous function that's simply sending text back to the browser. Sounds similar to what we did before, except much less lines, isn't it? And then it's listening on port 3000. All right, well, let's copy all of that so I don't have to type it in later. So Control C, and this shows me how I can install Express into my web app. Npm install, that looks familiar, and Express. So let's go into, let me just pull this aside. Let's go into Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to open up my terminal window. At least I thought I was. Backtick, there we go. Let's see, it looks like I already have a server running. Control C. So CLS for clear the screen so we can start from scratch. Okay. So let's see. The first thing I would like to do, I think, is I'm going to create myself the package JSON file so it can keep track of the things I'm working on. So I'm going to do npm init, and it's going to help me walk through creating that package JSON file. This should look familiar. Entry point index.js. So remember, that's the file I want to create here in a moment. And I'm just going to accept that. I should put my initials there maybe, and enter for yes. Okay, so I should now have a package JSON installed. Pretty basic JSON file. Looks good. Okay, remember that package JSON is sort of our configuration file, if you will, for the application that we're creating. All right, so now it said to do npm install express. So I'm going to npm express and see what happens. Internet's running, things are happening. I look super smart. Look at all that stuff going across my screen. Okay, notice that, remember that our node modules folder is being created. There's a bunch of things that are in there. I don't need to worry about those. Just know that it all works just great. And then we notice that our package JSON file was written this dependency property. So that way we know that we need Express, and there's the version of Express that we installed. So if someone else wants to install our application, this would enable them to install the dependencies as well. I think we've seen that in a prior lesson. Incidentally, I'm just going to bring this to your attention. If in documentation you see this -- save after the install, this -- save was what used to be required in order for the install to automatically write these dependencies to the package JSON file. But now with the newest version of Node, we don't have to include that -- save. As you can see, it was automatically done anyway. So we don't need that. Okay. So we need to create that index.js file. I don't think that's quite what I wanted to do here. New file. Oh, I have this. There we go. Now let's create a new file. That's trying to put it in my node modules. I don't want to do that. Let's click outside of node modules. There we go. Create a new file called index.js. Okay. And I'm just going to paste that code that we saw prior in the npm documentation. That, let's see, so it's creating it's requiring Express. That makes sense because we need to require the module that we're going to be using. This particular line is creating a new Express object, and it's creating a new application object. We are keeping it in this variable called app, and that's a lot of interesting words. Let's just run it, and then we're going to go into the Express documentation and look that up a little bit more. But let's run this and just see if it works for now, and then we'll delve in a little bit deeper. Index probably isn't what I want to do. Let's do node and index and run that. So ideally there is a server running. It didn't give me any feedback, but then again there's no console log to indicate that there should be any feedback. So if I bring over my web browser again, and we're going to go to, remember we did 127. Incidentally, you can also do localhost. That resolves to the 127. Said we were listening on port 3000, so let's see what happens. I am guessing I didn't make this save. I did not save it, so that's a problem. So now let's save it, and I have to run it again. Node index, here we go. And let's see if that doesn't enable me to pull this over again. I'm trying to pull my browser over. There it is. Okay. So now let's run it and see if it does send, in fact, hello world. So it received my request, which at this point is just the /, and that sent over this hello world. So same thing we did in our last lesson, but heck of a lot quicker and easier. All right, so I should keep this browser over. And what I want to bring to your attention then is if we look at this Express documentation, this is a good place to go to explore some of the things that we are doing with Express and we're about to do again in a moment. So expressjs.com and getting started. You can look to see install. Well, we just did all of that, so that's something that you might, obviously some other documentation doing the same thing. If we click on Hello World, well, this is Express's version of giving you an example of exactly what we just did. This time you can see a little bit different. You can see, this is interesting, we just did app listen 3000, and now you see some comma and some what appears hieroglyphically or scary until you really look at it a little bit more detailed. And remember that all we're doing here is sending an anonymous function. There's no parameters that are or arguments that are being sent. The fat arrow simply is a shortcut for the function word. And then it's console logging the fact that it's actually running, which was lacking in ours. So there's another way to do the same thing, but the rest of this looks pretty darn similar. We just put require express. They added on the version, but our package.json is keeping track of that as well. So you could go through here. There's how you run it. Well, we've already done that. So getting it started, I'm going to skip Express Generator for now. You're welcome to look at it, but I just want to keep it simple. And I'm going to move to basic routing. And in basic routing, here's a little bit more detail of what we were using in our code. If you remember, let's see if I can put these side by side so we can look at them together. So we have this app get, and if we look in the documentation, app get is receiving a method. Remember, we've talked about methods post and get, and if you don't specifically send like a form as a method post, then get is the default. So we've used get, and here's the documentation of where that get word is coming from. So we can go, there's the post, etc., etc. So here's some documentation. There's the path, and then the handler. We used it. We have a anonymous function. We've seen this in the last lesson. That is, the function parameters are request and then a response, and then we sent back a response to the browser. So let's see, what else do we need to accomplish here? I think that's all here. So the next thing I want to bring to your attention is we're going to, where shall I point you next? Let's look at well, static files. This is more I'm not sure that we're going to be messing with this so much today, but if you click on API reference, we'll go to 4. You'll see on the right hand side here some more detailed information. Obviously that was just getting started, but here's the real ninny. So here's the Express. We saw that we were creating a new Express app object. So if you start to look through here, you'll start to see what these things mean. So here is your documentation on how to utilize the Express module, basically. If you click on response, here is documentation on the response that we sent. So the response object, and that we're sending information. So let's see, where did I want to take you next? Oh, this is where I wanted to go next. Response, now we're going to send a file. So now we're not just sending text, we're going to send a file. So if we look here, we can see that we are sending a path name. So that we just saw that I was pointing out to Node.js, we saw that path. Let's see, remember this part? We saw path here, so we might utilize that. We have send file. Okay, so you can spend time looking at this. I would suggest you do, but I'm trying to give you in a quick way places to look for, so when I do the code, if you want to look at more detail on how it's working, rather than, oh, she's typing a whole bunch of stuff on the screen and I got to keep up and I don't know what, this is where you can find the I don't know what. So that's why I'm spending so much time trying to walk you through the documentation here. So this is the place where you can find the things that we are doing in our examples, and of course to help you find whatever else you might be playing around with. All right, so now we're going to, instead of serving up this hello world, let's serve up a index.html page. So let's then create an index.html page. Index.html, and I just have some code off to the side here, so I'm just going to copy that and bring it over. No, not. Okay, so HTML, and then H1, and here is my index page. Okay, obviously not complete HTML, but it's going to work for the purposes of this demonstration. All right, so back to our index.js. Okay, so next we're going to, hey, look, they didn't put semicolons. Not good practice. Well, we're going to, because, you know, there we go. Okay, let us create, we're going to create a variable called path, and I'm going to require path like we saw a little bit earlier. I pointed out in the Nodejs documentation. So we're going to utilize, let's see, we're going to put it here in our get method. And what our job here is, we're going to send using response. We're going to send back a file. Send file. Look, it's even here for us. That's good. Send file. And this is where path comes into play. I'm just going to type it out. And path name. There's that dir name that we saw, that global variable, plus, and then index.html. Go. Okay. So what have I done? By using, well, let's look inside the parentheses first, because that's how things are rendered. So using that global variable, dir name, that's returning the directory of the file that's being called, or where the request has been received. So in this current directory, so that's a relative directory, right? So the relative directory plus I want this file name. Okay. If you're not sure what all that means, I would suggest you console log the directory name so you can see what's being returned. I'm joining those two together in my path object, and that's what I'm going to be sending to as my response. So if all goes the way I hope it's going to go, I better save it. Instead of getting hello world, we should now get this index.html page. So remember, I made a change to my configuration, so I need to stop the current server, run a new version, bring over my browser, and localhost. So now instead of hello world, when I hit refresh, there's my index page. So doing the same thing we did in the last lesson, but utilizing the Express module to make our lives a little bit easier. So new framework, and remember, frameworks are there to, somebody else has written all that code that we get to utilize to get us up and running faster, so we don't have to recreate the wheel all the time. So now we don't have to create the server, we simply are utilizing the Express object or the Express module to create a application object that then gives us the ability to get up and running with the server that much faster. So I encourage you to look at the documentation on Node.js and also Express to get more comfortable with some of the methods and so forth that we used, and get cracking. Oh wait, wrong software. Get started creating some servers using Express module.